All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Chad Carlson. Welcome to our fourth webinar at Platform.sh. Thank you so much for coming and joining with us. Before I start, hopefully you've had the chance already to make it out for some of our past webinars. Going forward, we're going to try to continue holding them on at least a once-a-month basis. So keep an eye out and attend the ones that seem interesting to you, since across all our teams, we're doing some really interesting stuff that we wanted to share with you and get your feedback on. But if you did happen to miss the previous three webinars, you can access them now on our YouTube channel, Platform.sh, and they're sorted under the webinars playlist there. We'll be sure to include a link to that in the email that we send out after this webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about Probot and GitHub Apps. How you can use Probot as a framework and a tool to build your own GitHub apps, register them with GitHub, and install them on your repositories with the apps themselves hosted on a Platform.sh project. So, little introduction. Howdy, my name is Chad Carlson. I'm a technical writer for the developer relations team here at Platform.sh. Our team manages and writes our public documentation and moderates our community site. We'll also provide a link for that because that's another great resource for finding anything platform-based. But our team, the DevRel team, manages and maintains also all of our templates that you can find on GitHub and you can initialize in your management console for new projects. And Probot, the one I'm going to be talking about today, is one of those templates. Before we get into that template specifically, which allows you to really quickly deploy a GitHub app on Platform.sh, I want to really briefly touch on what GitHub apps are themselves, in case anyone isn't familiar, and how they use the GitHub API to listen to activities from and interact with repositories. Then we'll move on to Probot itself and how it utilizes a manifest YAML file to set permissions for your apps and set them up to register on GitHub. Then we can look at the template itself and some of the choices that we've made in our team that simplify the typical registration process for apps, and finally touch on how, once you can deploy it on Platform.sh, how you can leverage the fact that you are able to create a live environment for your staging or development branches of your project, and how that can be leveraged to create fully registered development versions of these GitHub apps that you can test on separate repositories as you're developing them, verify that as you change the behavior that it's working as you expected it to with maybe new permissions, and then merge them into your production app and have this really great DevOps workflow when working on your GitHub apps. So first, GitHub apps. So what are they exactly? GitHub apps are described in their documentation as first-class actors. That is, that they aren't associated necessarily with a GitHub account. They have their own identity on GitHub. They come with built-in webhooks that interact with the GitHub API. And once they're hosted somewhere, registered and installed on a repository, they use the API to listen for events and respond to them, depending on the permissions that are set for them and that the users that own those repositories have granted to those apps. And chances are you're already using a GitHub app on your repositories, and I've listed some of the more popular and common ones here. In the top left, we have those that help with consistent code quality and test coverage. And in their case, when they're installed, they use read access to the code in your repositories and write access to pull requests to provide suggestions and metrics for those pull requests. Circle CI and Travis CI, these are continuous integration tools that I'm sure you've seen before, and they require access to your pull requests for builds, tests, and deployments. Those are some of the bigger ones, but we also have these two in the bottom right for project management that are actually built using this Probot framework that we're going to talk about. The stale app here closes stale issues and pull requests, and the work in progress application blocks merge requests on those PRs that have the WIP colon as a prefix for the name of that pull request, something that is already in place on GitLab if you've seen it there. All of these apps use the GitHub API to interact with the repositories and specifically target the pull requests and issue endpoints once they're installed to interact with these actions. Now, for all of these examples, the apps were developed and registered with GitHub and then shared through the marketplace, the app marketplace, which sets your apps as public so that anybody on GitHub can install your application. You can deploy the template we're going to talk about and change its behavior to how you want it and list it here on the marketplace as well if you wanted to. I want to follow some of the installation steps because it's going to be similar to how we test this app we're going to deploy, but this is essentially what it's going to look like if somebody tries to install your application on their repository. They select the app that they're going to install, usually some distinction if there's some charging for the app of whether it is an open source repo or a private one, and completes the order based off of that selection. And then you install the app on the repository. GitHub apps come with a lot of fine-grained permissions. First of all, that they can be placed on individual repositories or across a whole organization. And then when you select an individual repository, you can do it one by one. Second, the app that we're going to build is going to have permissions set for its configuration. This is all user-side permissions. But then once we can set the permissions of what the app is actually listening to, this manifest file that we're going to cover in the next section is going to control this block of with these permissions that you see at the bottom. Here, CodeCov needs read access to my code, read access to administration issues and metadata, and then read and write access to checks, commit statuses, and pull requests. These are set in that manifest file and then have to be explicitly accepted by the user when they go through the installation process. So hopefully that, if you weren't totally familiar, that gives you a little overview of what GitHub apps are themselves. They listen for actions on repositories and respond to them once the permissions have been accepted by the user for that repo. Each one of these apps, they have their own external code base and they're hosted somewhere listening for these events. But as you play around with them, you very well might come to the point where, just out of curiosity, like myself when I started this project, you might wonder how it is that you might go about building one yourself, even if it's just you have actions that you're interested in responding to, isolated to your own organization and your team, or it is something that you want to make more public and even put on the marketplace. And this is really where we get to the Probot framework, which helps you build GitHub apps relatively simply. So Probot is written in TypeScript, and it's framework for building GitHub apps in Node.js. And it is a pretty interesting framework. I mean, they have a sort of pseudo CLI that you can start a very, very simple Probot app just through npx or yarn. And locally, you can register that app with a webhook server to start playing around with it in just a few minutes. I mean, running this command at the bottom of the screen, which is very close to the app that we're going to deploy on Platform, will get you started in just a few minutes. If you go to their principal site, probot.github.io, that we will include in the links for the webinar, they have this whole community section that is filled with examples of different people leveraging the GitHub API and the Probot framework to make all kinds of really, really interesting stuff. As far as the syntax goes for these applications, I mean, it's a Node.js framework. So you can define this application that can listen to any endpoint in the GitHub API if it's a simple set of actions in a single index.js file. So here is an example of one of the simple template projects that you can start with npx or yarn. This is the one that we're actually going to deploy, which it listens on the repository it's been installed on for new issues that have been opened. And when it detects that it has been opened on that repository, it will deliver a comment in that issue thread, just with this small chunk of code here. After that index.js file is defined, all you need to do is configure its permissions in this manifest file that I briefly touched on. It's not a completely necessary inclusion to your repository, because you can go directly into GitHub, register an app even without a code base, and set those permissions manually through just GitHub itself. But the manifest file makes it easy to commit those permissions into your app, which really works nicely alongside this infrastructure as code idea that we try to stick to at Platform. In that file, we have this array of default events, which in this case is only issues for the simple opening an issue comment application, and then a complementary default permissions block with these attributes of write access to these issues so that we can actually deliver the comment, and metadata to get information about the repository itself. And with these two attributes, we have the permissions to execute this delivery of the comment on a new issue. The final three keys at the bottom are information about the app that appears to the outside world. So if we take that code.cov example that I touched on at the beginning, when you go to the homepage of code.cov, it has this detailed description of what the application is and details about what permissions that need to be granted in order for it to run, along with its title. All of that information can be set inside this app YAML in these last few attributes. The final one, not the final one, sorry, this hook attributes at key right here are what's necessary inside this file to configure where the app is hosted. So GitHub's going to use this key to know, okay, that this application is supposed to be listening to a particular repository, and when, in this case, an issue is open, when that event occurs, what URL do I send that to? That's defined in this hook attributes URL key here. We can set this one manually, but obviously that's not what is ideal in this situation, especially on Platform. We create these generated URLs and we have multiple branches. So what this webhook URL is going to be is going to change slightly across those branches. And we'd like this to be sort of an automatic process, which is what's great about our template is once you do that, it is set up to automatically detect this attribute from the environment you deploy for each one of those branches and set this value automatically. So that's Probot. And we could develop one locally that's concerned with some events and has some permissions set in that manifest file to handle those events. And we can, if we use that npx command, that hook attributes URL here at the bottom is going to be automatically set for a temporary webhook payload server called sme.io so that we can do our testing entirely locally to begin with. And that is really great. But ultimately, if we want this thing to be a production GitHub app, we want to deploy it somewhere. And between setting that URL attribute and distinguishing how it's set across branches, we can do that pretty easily with the template that we set up on Platform. So we already provide a Node.js runtime container that it's going to use, and you can visit this repository here right now and click the button in the README to get this deployed in a second. All of our templates are in this Platform.sh-templates organization, and you can find it under Probot there. It has a pretty detailed README, so you can follow a lot of the steps that I'm going to cover in this webinar and get it going yourself. After we deploy it, either through this button or through the management console, we can register the app with GitHub, and it will retrieve that URL for the branch that we're on and send us a few credentials that we're going to save as environment variables that will actually get us running as a production application. Now, in preparing to do that, we'll go through one step that may seem a little odd at first, that typically when you deploy a GitHub app, a Probot app, on another hosting provider, it will include a direction to retrieve these credentials and set those environment variables manually through whatever their version of setting those environment variables looks like for that platform. But again, we have generated URLs for each of our branches, and ideally, if we want to make changes to our app, like let's say in our example, we're only concerned with responding to new issues, but really we want to take this template and expand it to respond to pull requests, we need to update our manifest file to include those new permissions, but we want to test them out. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set up a way to automatically retrieve these credentials from GitHub during the registration process and set them automatically on an environment by environment basis, which is going to make it a lot easier in the long run. So let's see what that looks like. When we register this thing with GitHub, our app's going to provide our manifest file, and we're going to register with GitHub and execute this first handshake to get a temporary code that allows us to get those variables that I've listed here. There is an ID associated with your application on GitHub, a webhook secret property that's specific to Probot, and a private key that's generated by GitHub and sits with your application settings for that app. This is a stripped down version of a script that runs when the app deploys in the template, and it's concerned with using the Platform.sh CLI to set those environment variables automatically once the registration process is done. Notice that these variables are, again, they're only set to be defined and set to an individual environment. We have this platform branch environment variable that's exposed on Platform.sh. And that's going to give us the ability to have different versions of our apps, like specifically a staging version of our application that is always running for us to test on. So in order to get this script to work and have the CLI running in our application container, we need to add a token that Platform provides for you with your accounts so that it can interact with this Platform.sh API. So let's go ahead and deploy this thing and see what it looks like. Got a video here. So we're going to go to that templates organization on GitHub and find this deploy on platform button here inside the README on that Probot repo. All the steps here I'm going to cover are listed in that README, but by all means, take a look now and you'll get a feel of what it's going to be like when you do so. So as this thing is starting to deploy, we're going to go to our account section and create this API token I was talking about. Again, seems like a little bit of an odd step, but it's going to remove the necessity for us to set all of these variables that we get from our registration handshake with GitHub and do it all automatically. Once we've gotten that API token, we're just going to set it at a project level variable. So we only need to do this the one time for our production application, and then it'll be able to apply for each one of our environments after that fact. So I've set aside a terminal here next to my management console view of the project. And inside the README, I have this command here that's setting the Platform.sh CLI token to that token value that we just created in the accounts. We can set a few individual settings that have to do with visibility of that variable. and then redeploy the environment so that those settings get saved to our project. It'll just take a second to redeploy that environment. And we can move back over to that project. And we get the green check mark that everything is completed. We can go to that provided URL at the bottom and see that we have the registration screen for Probot right here. And all we need to do is go through the registration steps after that. We can click the register GitHub app here that's provided on our environment, and it's going to fill out this title from what we've defined in our manifest file, this app YAML file that's inside of our repository. I can just give it a different name if I wanted to. And then when I create the GitHub app, it's going to write that app ID, webhook secret, and private key to a temporary file in our project. And from that manifest, we create this landing page here. You can modify this to whatever you want that'll change the way that it appears to people who install your application on the repository. And the interesting thing here is if we go to our app settings, we see that it fills out that description, and there we go. It automatically set that webhook URL attribute from our environment, from our master environment on Platform. But if we go to our advanced settings here, we have the list of our deliveries, and we see that the first one failed during this registration process. We have a file right here we use on Platform, this .environment file, and right now node.env is set to development for that registration stage, and all we're going to do now is we're going to set it for production and push that to our project. Now that we've gotten those credentials, it will finish the registration process on our side and set this thing up for production. I've cut out a lot of time here, but it will just take a second for it to finish this part right here. We finish the deploy hook that builds the application itself. And then once we enter the deploy hook in just a moment, it's going to detect that it's now set up for production and that those variables have been written to that temporary file from when we actually registered with GitHub. And then it's going to run that script that I showed briefly about setting those variables setting that temporary file to have those environment variables for just this master environment. So the deploy hook is started here. And here we go. It automatically triggered the three variables, the app ID, the app ID, webhook secret, and private key, along with two additional variables that protect the way that this acts across environments, a registered check and a webhook URL for our environment. Once it's finished, we can refresh the page and we see we don't have the ability to register this thing anymore. It's been fully set up for production. And we can redeliver that first payload. And there we go. We got the 200 response that we expect and we want for this to be set up and actually start listening for events. So great, we got a production app, it's registered on GitHub, and we are receiving deliveries from GitHub. So we just need to install it somewhere and check that everything's behaving the way that we would expect. So this template is actually deploying that GitHub app I mentioned at the beginning, that it's just listening for issue comments. So we can go back to our advanced settings here and activate the app so we can start installing it and then select the repo that we want to test it on. So I've selected my own account, and I'm just going to pick an individual repository to test this thing on, which is the Django Nautic repository. I have very explicitly the permissions that it's requesting for me to approve access to metadata and read and write access to issues. And then if I go to that repository, this should all be hooked up on our production app to start delivering comments to new issues on this repository. Sorry about that one, guys. I thought I had edited out that first one. So I've delivered the first issue comment, and there we go. Our GitHub app has delivered this issue comment on the repository. In this case, this is set up for a larger demo to handle environments that I'm going to go over in this webinar. And it's going to deliver that comment here on the issue. So great. We went ahead and set this thing up in only a couple of minutes and got a nice little Probot starter app going. The great thing that I mentioned is Platform.sh creates these exact clones of production environments for development and staging branches. And since we went through the effort of creating an API token for the entire project, we can branch off this production app and make it a separate live application that's registered with GitHub and test any changes that we want to make to permissions, or in the case I'm going to show you here, the content of this message that gets delivered as a comment. So let's go ahead and test and see what that looks like. So we're going to branch and build and deploy this updated branch and register it separately on GitHub. Since every environment is wholly isolated, we're going to retrieve new registration credentials from GitHub to register a separate app, just like we did on our master branch. So we're going to create the branch and temporarily reset node-env to development so that we can go through the registration again on that branch and then make the changes that we want. So this is a quick view of the application itself. This is my index.js file, which in this simple example defines my entire app alongside that manifest YAML file. So what I'm doing is I'm loading a YAML file that exists inside my repo and defining it as this Platform.sh variable and saying that the body of each of these issue comments is going to be this Platform.sh issue opened, whatever the text is defined in that YAML file. So on this new branch, all I'm going to do is edit this value to instead read from another bit of text that I have in here that has issue open for this new branch. And so that's going to be my change on this new branch for this index.js file. And when we made that change, we could push the environment, and there's one additional command just because at Platform, like, you can have as many branches as you want, but they don't necessarily become environments. So we activate that environment. So we have pushed it. We visit that branch from the management console. And here we go. We got a whole new registration page. So this is going to look very similar to what we showed, or what I showed before for the production environment. It automatically pulls that branch name so that we can keep track in our own advanced settings so that we don't confuse our production app from our staging one. And go to the settings for that app, and we'll see that again, that the first delivery didn't deliver in the same way that production had initially. So same thing. All we're going to do is reset node environment for production and then push those changes so those variables can be set from this new handshake for the separate app. And there we go. They'll go ahead and set automatically for us on this updates branch, on this updates environment. And we've redelivered that request that sets at 200 and activate that new environment. and we can go ahead and test out our changes on a new repository. So we should be able to see that instead of the initial message that we saw, a new issue comment to prove that we have a totally separate installed application with some different behavior on it. So I have this separate Bamboo repository. I'm going to open the new issue there. And after I submit the issue, we have a totally different issue comment here. So we have a separate app with separate behavior on another repository. And this could be our staging version of the application right there. All right, I'm satisfied with those changes. That's really the issue comment that I really rather have delivered for this application. So I can go ahead and check out my master production environment and merge those changes into the production app. And when we do that, we'll be able to see this new behavior on the production app and continue to go through this cycle from our staging, merge into production in order to get this app into exactly the behavior and response to events on the repositories that they're installed on that we want. So there we go. We don't need to reset any variables. This is our production app. I can go back to the original Django Nautic repository that our production app is installed on and open another issue. And in this case, we should have the comment that was visible in our staging environment here now on our production without having to update anything on the repository itself that had it installed. And there we go. We got the rabbit image and the new message, and everything has been updated after the merge. So there you go. There's a quick overview of GitHub apps and what they might be useful for, of how they interact with the GitHub API, and how they can be built with Probot and deployed pretty quickly in a fairly automatic way with Platform.sh. What would be next after this sort of setup, now that we have these development environments set up the way they are as well? First off, just to touch again, you can go to our platform.sh.templates organization and check out the Probot repository to deploy this yourself, and check the README to find some more details about exactly the steps that I went through in this webinar for it. And alternatively, if you already have a platform account, you can visit the management console and filter our templates for Node.js and find the Probot template there. They can be launched straight from the UI here. And permissions. I mean, this is a fairly simple app. This is what, as I said, gets started when you use NPX and Probot to create something that's essentially a hello world app. It's unlikely that if you're going to take this template or try to deploy something similar yourself or migrate what you already have, that you're going to want something with only the behavior of responding to issues and leaving comments. You can modify those permissions and go into that app YAML manifest file and uncomment some of the additional events that are left inside that template or generated by Probot itself, uncomment them and add new default events that it listens for right there. You can respond to deployment statuses when somebody forks the repository, deliver some instructions for how that they can contribute to the primary project, and retrieve security vulnerability alerts, and a lot more endpoints that are described in that file and in the GitHub API documentation, just by modifying this app YAML file here in the default events attribute and a matching one in default permissions. So if I was to add an event for pull requests in that first attribute for default events, I would just uncomment this pull request read access here in default permissions. And then the app will be fully set up to request that access from any user that installs the app. Another interesting one that there are a few examples in the Probot documentation is how to integrate your apps with external services. In most cases, you could probably get away with your manifest and the GitHub API alone being able to manage all the data you need to interact with repositories. But you may find a case where you do need to access an external data source. And these examples show you how to configure MongoDB, MySQL, Postgres, and Elasticsearch indexes in order to do so. And on Platform, that's obviously something that we're really set up to help out with, because you can follow Probot's instructions for modifying your manifest file and adding the correct listening functions to your index.js file to interact with these services. But then to add them yourselves to the project, all you need to do is put a few lines of YAML in your services YAML and app YAML file for the matching relationship. And you could really be well on your way and still be set up on some staging server from this original deployment. And lastly, if you have questions on Probot, this is just a shout out because it's, I think, a great idea that Probot does, is every Friday at 1:30, you can come check in on what's changing with Probot or any questions that you might have about your specific use case, and just join their Zoom meeting, and you can ask your questions there. Otherwise, in that template README, it has all the steps for setting this up and a few suggestions of other projects to branch off of and add extended permissions for your app. And that's the coverage that I wanted to give on Probot today. I really hope that this was a helpful introduction to Probot and GitHub Apps on Platform. After the webinar, we'll make sure to send out all the documentation and template links that I mentioned so that you can try this out yourself. And that is all for me. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Chad, we do have one question for you. If I install a GitHub app on some repositories, then update its permissions, do those repositories get those updated permissions automatically, or do they need to update manually?
So, okay, that's a good question. So that was a use case that I described quickly in here. So we launched this template right off the bat. All the permissions that it's going to request from people who install it are you okay with posting comments to issues that I open? But as you're developing, you say, I actually really want this thing to be concerned with pull requests, so I add that to the app YAML, put it to staging, merge in production. What happens in that initial repository? As the template is set up, it's not going to notify the user that those permissions have changed. And when I've tested just sort of how Probot works in this case, is it is going to continue the old behavior that the user has accepted for those permissions. So in this case, only for issue comments. What you can do is in Probot's documentation, you can look at, I believe it's the callback URL attribute of that manifest YAML file, and you can set up your Probot app to have a update permissions page on that production application, so that when a permission has changed and the user attempts to use it, they will then be able to, at the very most, say, yes, I accept the new permissions. The way it's set up is it's not going to just change those permissions in the background, because the user has already said, all I want is issue comments to be allowed. But it does provide a really easy way for minimizing the amount of work that a user who installs that app has to do when issue permissions are updated after the fact. Any more questions from anybody?
I see one more that just popped up. How do I publish the app to the marketplace?
Okay, so in the template itself and the way that GitHub sets up your app during the registration process, it will automatically just say that it's visible to yourself or to your organization. But in the same way that I clicked the active check mark inside of the app settings, there is also a red fielded make public button. And that is really the only change that needs to be made after you are satisfied with all the testing and have the basic functionality that you want. You click that make public button and it will at least be searchable inside the marketplace there. I believe that the way that it gets ranked in the marketplace is entirely dependent on the number of downloads that happen over a certain period, but it will at least be searchable there.
Perfect. And that is all I see for questions, unless anyone has any last minute ones.
Nobody else? Thank you guys so much for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.